It was a quiet Monday morning, April 26th, 1999, the kind of soft, sun-washed London day that felt too gentle to hold violence. Gowan Avenue, a tidy street in Fulham lined with magnolia trees and well-kept terraces, stirred only with the hum of distant traffic and the occasional bark of a neighbor's dog. The city was waking, commuters rustling papers at bus stops, the air scented faintly of coffee and spring rain. At 11:30 a.m., a familiar figure approached her own doorstep. Jill Dando, Britain's golden girl of television journalism, her smile known to millions from the BBC's Crime Watch. She carried a handful of post, keys in her fingers, a calm routine broken only by the sound of her own footsteps. Moments later, that serenity was obliterated by a single, sharp crack, the unmistakable sound of a gunshot in a neighborhood unaccustomed to murder. A neighbor, startled by what sounded like a car backfiring, peeked through a lace. Jill lay collapsed on the doorstep, her head resting at an unnatural angle, blood pooling into the grooves of the front path. A blue and white envelope slipped from her hand, paper darkened with red. The attacker was nowhere to be seen, no running footsteps, no shadow darting into an alley, just the ghostly calm that follows sudden violence. The street was still, eerily so, as if the world had exhaled and refused to breathe again. Within minutes, the first emergency call went through. "There's a woman lying outside number 29, Gowan Avenue. She's not moving." The operator's tone sharpened. Questions followed fast. Was she conscious? Was there any sign of life? The neighbor's voice cracked. "It's Jill Dando. I think she's been shot." The words rippled through the switchboard, triggering an emergency response that would soon spiral into one of the most complex murder investigations in British history. Police cars screamed through Fulham's narrow lanes, sirens bouncing off the brickwork. When the first officers arrived, they were met with a scene both tragic and surreal. Jill's body was still warm, her pulse faint but fading. A single 9mm bullet wound to the left temple, execution style, clean, precise. No sign of struggle, no robbery, no witness. Her handbag was untouched, her jewelry still on. The weapon gone. A paramedic's hand trembled as he felt for a pulse again, nothing. At 1:03 p.m., Jill Dando was pronounced dead at Charing Cross Hospital. Back on Gowan Avenue, the cordon went up. Blue tape fluttered across the street. Uniformed officers ushered onlookers away. Reporters began to gather, cameras already clicking before the story was even understood. The irony was cruel. Britain's most beloved reporter had become the very subject of a murder investigation. She had spent her career presenting the faces of criminals and victims alike on Crime Watch, asking viewers to help catch killers. Now, detectives stood where she once might have filmed an appeal, her own case about to dominate headlines across the world. Detective Chief Superintendent Hamish Campbell, a seasoned investigator, arrived at the scene and paused beside the forensic officers kneeling near the body. He had seen dozens of homicides, but something about this one felt different, deliberate, surgical, almost professional. A single shot, fired point-blank, with no hesitation and no attempt to disguise it. Whoever had done this had either been waiting or had followed her, calm enough to pull the trigger in broad daylight and vanish within seconds. "It's an assassination," one officer muttered under his breath. Campbell didn't disagree. By early afternoon, crime scene technicians in white suits combed the pavement, photographing every inch, collecting fibers, scraping under Jill's fingernails for any trace of her killer. Yet nothing seemed out of place. No footprints in the soft soil near the gate, no cigarette butt, no glove fiber, no weapon. Even the CCTV coverage of the surrounding streets offered little, just blurred images of passing cars and pedestrians who looked ordinary. It was as if the killer had stepped out of thin air and disappeared back into it. Meanwhile, news of Jill's death swept through the BBC headquarters like a thunderclap. Colleagues wept openly. Editors froze mid-broadcast. Phones rang endlessly. The newsroom, where Jill's bright voice had often filled the air, fell into stunned silence. Across Britain, television screens flashed breaking news banners. BBC presenter Jill Dando shot dead in London. Viewers who had invited her into their homes for years now watched, numb, as helicopters filmed the scene from above, her house reduced to a small, behind police tape. Outside the cordon, neighbors stood with hands pressed to their mouths. They spoke in whispers about the stranger some thought they'd seen earlier, a tall man loitering near the street corner, dressed neatly, perhaps too neatly. Others remembered nothing unusual at all. Yet even as speculation buzzed, one truth crystallized. Whoever killed Jill Dando had chosen the perfect time and place, a quiet street, a single opportunity, a moment so brief it left almost no trace. By dusk, detectives faced their first long night. The rain began to fall, washing the pavement clean, blurring blood into the cracks of the concrete. The forensics team packed their kits, cameras flashing for the final shots of the day. The body was gone, but the echo of violence lingered. A reporter's voice broke through the drizzle on the evening news, solemn and disbelieving. Tonight, Britain mourns one of its brightest stars. The question remains, who would want Jill Dando dead and why? The hours following Jill Dando's murder unfolded like a slow-motion disaster, each revelation deepening the confusion. Within minutes, every major news channel had broken from scheduled programming. The BBC newsroom, Jill's second home, became a scene of chaos and grief. Senior producers stared at screens showing the house on Gowan Avenue, its familiar doorway now the centerpiece of a murder mystery. Colleagues who had once joked with her over coffee were suddenly fielding calls from journalists around the world, asked to describe a woman whose life had been stolen in broad daylight. Television screens across Britain glow softly in dim living rooms. Viewers sit frozen, faces lit by the blue light of the broadcast, showing Jill's smiling photo beside the headline, BBC presenter Jill Dando shot dead. Her image, bright, kind, familiar, fills the screen, surrounded by flickering candles and silent disbelief. Outside, the rain-streaked windows reflect the nation's mourning, atmosphere tender, tragic and reverent, the collective grief of a country losing its symbol of grace. Detectives from the Metropolitan Police's Serious Crime Group quickly set up an incident room at Fulham Police Station. Maps of the area were pinned across the walls, with red circles marking CCTV locations and potential escape routes. The murder weapon, believed to be a 9mm semi-automatic pistol, was still missing. Ballistic experts noted that the bullet had been modified, a single hollow-point round, designed to expand on impact, maximizing fatal damage. It was the kind of bullet used in professional hits, not random street crimes. Yet Jill Dando had no known enemies, no stalkers, no scandals. "This is not a robbery," DCS Hamish Campbell told his team grimly. "This is personal, or it's a message." In the first 24 hours, detectives pursued over 500 lines of inquiry. They spoke to neighbors, postmen, and anyone who had been in Gowan Avenue that morning. They pulled hours of CCTV footage from nearby shops and bus stops, scouring for any figure that might have followed her. A man in a dark suit appeared briefly on one tape, walking near the scene around the time of the murder, but his face was never clearly captured. Witness descriptions varied: tall, white, possibly middle-aged, but nothing conclusive. The killer had struck in a narrow window of time, no more than a few seconds between Jill's arrival and the gunshot, then vanished. By the second day, media speculation was spiraling. Tabloids ran with theories faster than police could disprove them. Was this a contract killing? A revenge attack by a criminal exposed on Crime Watch? A jealous ex-lover? A crazed fan? Every possibility seemed both plausible and absurd. Some papers hinted at Balkan connections, that her death might be retaliation for NATO's involvement in the Kosovo conflict after the BBC's coverage had angered certain groups. Others whispered about shadowy figures in organized crime. The murder had the signature of precision. One shot, no hesitation, clean getaway. To the public, it was both terrifying and fascinating. Back at the incident room, a profile began to take shape. Jill was last seen alive around 11:30 a.m., having left her fiancé's home in Chiswick to drive back to her own house in Fulham. She hadn't been living there regularly. The property was partly unoccupied, suggesting someone who knew her schedule had been watching. The killer had either known she'd return that morning or waited for hours. Forensics confirmed there was no sign of forced entry or struggle. Jill had been caught completely off guard. A single muzzle imprint on her temple indicated the gun had been pressed directly against her head, a sign of absolute control. Detectives canvassed her professional life. Jill was loved and admired by colleagues, known for her kindness and lack of arrogance. She had never received serious threats, though like many public figures, she occasionally got strange letters. Nothing, however, hinted at violence. Detectives also questioned her fiancé, Dr. Alan Farthing, a respected gynecologist who was devastated but cooperative. His alibi was solid. There were no signs of jealousy, no financial motive. As the first week passed, the investigation felt like chasing smoke. Every clue evaporated as soon as it appeared. Meanwhile, the country mourned. Outside the BBC television centre, flowers piled high, hundreds then thousands, covering the gates in a sea of color. Handwritten notes read, "Thank you, Jill. You made us proud." Strangers cried on live television. Her funeral at Weston-super-Mare drew huge crowds. Her hometown turned into a field of grief. Even the Queen sent condolences. Britain had lost not just a journalist, but an icon of decency, and the fact that her killer was still free haunted the national psyche. Detective Campbell's voice on the evening press briefing was firm but weary. "We are following every lead," he said, cameras flashing in his face. "This was a cold-blooded act, and we will not rest until the person responsible is found." Behind him, though, officers exchanged glances. They knew the truth. The trail was already going cold. With no witnesses, no clear motive, and no weapon, even Scotland Yard's finest were beginning to grasp how elusive this killer was. By the end of the week, more than 2,000 phone calls had poured into the tip line. Some claimed to have seen a man with a gun. Others swore it was a professional hit ordered from abroad. One caller mentioned a suspicious blue Range Rover parked near the street days earlier. Detectives checked every lead, none panned out. The investigation ballooned into one of the largest in London's history, consuming thousands of man-hours. And yet, behind the headlines and public statements, an uncomfortable question began to form in the minds of those closest to the case. What if this murder wasn't random, or professional, or political, but something far more unsettling? By the time spring melted into early summer, the Jill Dando investigation had become an all-consuming national obsession. Newspapers printed daily updates like serialized fiction, front-page spreads filled with grainy CCTV stills, speculative diagrams of possible escape routes, and endless headlines promising breakthrough in Dando case that rarely delivered. For the detectives of Operation Oxborough, as the investigation was formally called, the mounting pressure was unbearable. Each passing week without an arrest chipped away at public confidence and at the morale of the team. DCS Hamish Campbell, usually calm under pressure, now felt the weight of an entire nation demanding answers. "Find her killer," the tabloids shouted. "Justice for Jill." Yet every forensic test, every neighborhood interview, every lead turned to dust. Then, in early May 1999, a name began to circulate quietly through the ranks: Barry George, a loner who lived less than half a mile from Jill's home. He was known locally as eccentric, even unstable. Neighbors described him as a man who drifted through life, wearing military-style clothing and carrying cameras that often didn't work. He had a history of following women, impersonating celebrities, and making grandiose claims, at one point telling people he was Freddie Mercury's cousin. His past was dotted with minor offenses and odd behavior, but nothing that suggested murder. Still, something about him drew the detective's attention. He fit no clear profile, yet he existed on the edge of Jill's world, close enough to have seen her, obsessed enough to have fixated on her. Investigators began discreet surveillance. They watched as Barry wandered the streets, aimlessly, hands in pockets, muttering to himself. When officers eventually brought him in for questioning, he appeared nervous, distracted, but oddly cooperative. "I didn't kill her," he repeated, sometimes unprompted, as if trying to convince himself more than anyone else. Detectives noted inconsistencies in his answers about where he'd been on the day of the murder. He claimed to have been at home or out walking, but could not produce witnesses. They found a collection of photographs and clippings from magazines, none of Jill Dando, but of various female celebrities. To investigators desperate for direction, it was enough to justify digging deeper. The search of his flat at Crookham Road revealed a chaotic world, cluttered rooms, piles of newspapers, broken electronic equipment, and hundreds of photos of women taken from magazines. Among the mess, a forensic discovery electrified the investigation: a single microscopic particle of gunshot residue, GSR, found in the pocket of one of Barry's coats. The laboratory report said the particle was characteristic of firearm discharge. To detectives exhausted by months of dead ends, it felt like a turning point, the first tangible piece of evidence linking anyone to the killing. "This is it," one officer said. "We've got him." But not everyone was convinced. The GSR particle was so tiny it could have transferred from countless sources, from a police officer's holster, from contaminated evidence, even from simple environmental contact. Yet, under mounting media pressure, nuance was a luxury the police couldn't afford. Barry George's history of odd behavior, his proximity to the crime scene, and his reputation as a socially awkward misfit made him an easy target. The tabloids seized on his name, splashing his photo across covers with captions like "Loner arrested in Dando murder" and "Was this Jill stalker?" Inside the interrogation room, the questioning grew more intense. Barry, confused and frightened, alternated between rambling tangents and long silences. He spoke about fame, about being misunderstood, about wanting to be noticed. To detectives, it sounded like obsession. To psychologists, later, it would sound like delusion. When pressed about Jill, he denied ever meeting her. But investigators pointed to the fact that she lived so close by. Surely he had seen her, perhaps followed her? Barry simply shook his head, unable to provide answers that satisfied anyone. Eventually, after hours of questioning, he was charged with Jill Dando's murder. The public reaction was immediate and divided. Some celebrated the arrest as justice finally moving forward. "The killer caught," screamed one headline. Others, especially within the legal community, voiced doubts. Barry George had no history of violent crime, no known access to firearms, and little evidence tied him concretely to the shooting. Still, in the court of public opinion, the story made sense: a mentally unstable loner fixated on a television star. It fit the narrative the public could accept: simple, tragic, and contained. The notion of a professional assassination or political conspiracy was far too unsettling. In July 2001, 2 years after Jill's murder, Barry George stood trial at the Old Bailey. The prosecution built its case around that single particle of gunshot residue, his erratic behavior, and his supposed fascination with fame. The defense argued there was no forensic or eyewitness evidence proving he had ever been near the scene. Yet the emotional weight of the case, the nation's grief, and the desire for closure hung over the courtroom like a fog. After weeks of testimony, the jury returned with a verdict: guilty. Barry George was sentenced to life imprisonment. Outside, cameras flashed as reporters announced that justice had been served. Jill Dando's family, dignified in grief, expressed relief that the ordeal might finally be over. But among some detectives and forensic experts, quiet doubts lingered. The evidence was thin, almost dangerously so. As one officer later admitted privately, "We wanted a conviction so badly, we stopped asking whether we actually had the right man." And so, as the public sighed in relief and the headlines declared victory, a darker truth waited to surface: that beneath the tidy narrative lay inconsistencies, missing evidence, and questions too big to ignore. The real story of Jill Dando's murder was far from over. When the courtroom doors closed behind Barry George in July 2001, it seemed that the most shocking murder in modern British media history had finally been solved. The public, weary from 2 years of speculation and grief, accepted the verdict with a mix of relief and resignation. Jill Dando's face, once the emblem of calm professionalism, appeared on every front page once more, this time beside the words "justice served." For the BBC, for her family, for millions of viewers, the conviction offered a sense of closure that had seemed impossible. But beneath the surface, unease rippled through the corridors of Scotland Yard. Some detectives, especially those closest to the forensic side of the case, could not shake a nagging thought that they might have convicted an innocent man. In prison, Barry George became a ghost, locked away at HMP Whitemoor, labeled a killer, shunned by other inmates, and largely forgotten by the public that had once obsessed over him. His world shrank to the confines of a small cell and the endless echo of his own confusion. He wrote letters protesting his innocence, often clumsily worded, sometimes incoherent, but always pleading for someone to listen. "I didn't do it," he wrote in one. "I never even met her." Yet few paid attention. To most, the matter was settled. The loner had snapped, the beloved reporter had died, and justice had been done. Case closed. But science has a way of outliving assumptions. In 2002, forensic specialists began questioning the validity of the so-called crucial evidence, that single microscopic particle of gunshot residue found in George's coat pocket. New research revealed how easily such residue could be transferred from simple contact, from a police officer's uniform, from being near a firearm range, even from handling a contaminated object. The case that once seemed watertight began to leak under scrutiny. "It's the most fragile evidence I've ever seen used to convict a man of murder," one forensic expert later remarked. "It wouldn't stand up today." Meanwhile, investigative journalists started re-examining the case. Documentaries, newspaper exposés, and even radio programs began to question whether the police had been too eager to find a suspect, any suspect, to satisfy public outrage. Some recalled how early theories about a professional hit or foreign connection were dismissed too quickly once Barry George entered the frame. "It was tunnel vision," said one retired detective years later. "We saw what we wanted to see." Public opinion, once firmly against George, began to shift. Then came the appeals. Barry's legal team, now supported by human rights advocates, argued that his conviction was unsafe, that the evidence was purely circumstantial and the forensics unreliable. In 2002, his first appeal was rejected, but the campaign for his release continued. Journalists revisited witness statements, raising questions about police pressure and media influence. Some of Jill's own colleagues voiced quiet doubts, expressing sympathy for the possibility that the wrong man was paying for the crime. Even within the BBC, whispers circulated that something about the whole case never quite added up. Finally, in 2007, after 6 long years behind bars, the Court of Appeal ordered a retrial. The ruling centered on the unreliability of the gunshot residue evidence, the very heart of the prosecution's case. During the retrial, experts dismantled the idea that the single GSR particle could prove anything. There was no DNA, no fingerprints, no eyewitnesses. The entire case had rested on coincidence and conjecture. In August 2008, the jury returned its verdict, not guilty. Barry George, visibly dazed and trembling, was acquitted of Jill Dando's murder. After 8 years of imprisonment, he walked free, blinking into the daylight, a man forever marked by a crime he insisted he did not commit. Outside the courthouse, a media storm erupted once again. Cameras flashed, reporters shouted questions, and the world watched as Barry George, soft-spoken and bewildered, told the crowd, "I am innocent. I did not do this." For Jill Dando's family, the moment was bittersweet. Relief that an innocent man might not suffer unjustly mingled with renewed anguish that her true killer was still out there. "We just want to know the truth," her brother Nigel told the press quietly. "Whoever did this is still free." The acquittal reignited national debate. Had the police failed Britain's most beloved journalist by focusing on the wrong suspect? Or was George simply lucky to escape conviction a second time? Experts pointed out how the case had relied more on narrative than evidence, the tragic irony of a lonely, mentally fragile man cast as a dangerous stalker simply because it fit the public's need for a story. Operation Oxborough had consumed years, millions of pounds, and uncountable hours, yet the fundamental question remained unanswered. Who really killed Jill Dando? In the aftermath, Scotland Yard reopened lines of inquiry, reviewing old evidence with new technology. But time had eroded many possibilities. Witness memories had faded, physical evidence degraded, and digital archives from 1999 were incomplete by modern standards. Leads that once seemed promising had long since turned cold. Still, whispers persisted, of shadowy political motives, of professional assassins, of connections to cases Jill had covered on Crime Watch. Each theory had its believers. None had proof. By the end of 2008, Britain was left with a haunting conclusion. After all the headlines, trials, and theories, the murder of Jill Dando remained as mysterious as ever. The image that endured was the same one captured that spring morning in 1999, a quiet London street, an open doorway, and a woman whose death left behind not only grief, but a question that refuses to die. By late 2008, when Barry George walked free, Britain was once again left staring into the same abyss that had opened 9 years earlier. The relief of resolution was gone, replaced by something colder, uncertainty. The police, once confident they had caught their man, now faced the painful reality that the nation's most famous unsolved murder was back to square one. The file, thick with statements, maps, and photographs, was reopened under a cloud of quiet embarrassment. Behind closed doors at Scotland Yard, senior officers ordered a full re-examination of every lead ever logged under Operation Oxborough. But after nearly a decade, most of those leads were ghosts. Witnesses had moved, memories had faded, and the faint traces of physical evidence that might once have offered hope were long degraded. Still, the detectives knew one thing for sure. Someone had walked up to Jill Dando's doorstep in broad daylight, pressed a gun to her head, and vanished into London as if swallowed by it. Almost immediately, old theories returned to life. The Serbian revenge theory resurfaced first, the idea that Jill's murder had been a reprisal for NATO's bombing campaign in Yugoslavia, which the BBC had covered extensively at the time. Just weeks before her death, Jill had fronted a BBC appeal for Kosovar refugees, and some believed that her high-profile involvement had drawn the attention of Serbian extremists. Letters had been sent to British media outlets in 1999, threatening retaliation for Western involvement in the conflict. One even mentioned targeting a well-known BBC personality. For a time, intelligence agencies quietly explored the possibility of a politically motivated assassination. But MI5 found no credible evidence linking any foreign agent or group to the killing. Still, the theory refused to die. The idea of a professional hit had an eerie logic that many found more believable than random madness. Then there was the Crime Watch revenge theory. Jill Dando had hosted the program for years, helping to expose and publicize criminals across the UK. The show's reconstructions often led directly to arrests. Could one of those criminals, or an associate, have sought revenge? Detectives combed through archives of Crime Watch episodes, comparing the cases Jill had presented to potential suspects recently released from prison. Some names were flagged, men with violent pasts, others with grudges against the police or the BBC, but no concrete links emerged. As one retired investigator later put it, if someone wanted to send a message, they did it perfectly. One shot, one of the most famous women in Britain, and no trace left behind. A third theory, quieter but persistent, revolved around the possibility of a stalker. Jill, like many celebrities, had received fan mail, most harmless, some unsettling. Police reviewed thousands of letters from viewers, including a few from men who seemed fixated on her. But nothing pointed to a specific individual capable of carrying out such a precise killing. Jill's fiancé, Dr. Alan Farthing, told investigators that she had never expressed fear of anyone, never mentioned being followed or harassed. She was cautious, yes, but not paranoid. The idea that an obsessed fan could orchestrate such a calculated execution felt unlikely, though not impossible. Beyond these theories, the internet age began to twist the case into something new. Online forums, blogs, and later social media turned the Jill Dando murder into a breeding ground for speculation. Some claimed inside knowledge, others accused powerful institutions of cover-ups. Conspiracy theories multiplied: intelligence involvement, secret investigations, organized crime connections. One particularly persistent rumor suggested Jill had been investigating a BBC-linked child abuse ring, and that her death was meant to silence her, a claim never substantiated by evidence, but widely circulated in digital echo chambers. The more time passed, the more the truth seemed to slip further from reach, replaced by myths built from fragments of fact. Inside Scotland Yard, detectives tried to remain focused. In 2011, the Met announced a cold case review, hoping that advances in forensic technology might uncover something new. Evidence from Jill's home, clothing, and post was retested using modern DNA analysis.